All right, distinguished guests, colleagues and friends of the International Crisis Group, welcome back to our policy dialogue and thank you for having joined us again. These are certainly unique times, not only for the challenges in many of the conflicts that we're about to discuss, but also here in Europe where most of us are connected. So we appreciate your participation even more. My name is Giuseppe Famai and I coordinate the European Union work for the International Crisis Group, and I really have the great pleasure of welcoming you for the last day of this conference. Our annual policy dialogue day is part of the EU Watchlist series, which is the label and the umbrella for a set of activities that Crisis Group tailors to the EU and its member states. It includes a series of roundtables discussing international crises, the drivers of hostility and causes of instability, and policy options, especially for the EU and its member states, to prevent, mitigate, and help solve deadly conflict. Yesterday, we had an excellent start with an overview of the EU's role in conflict prevention after COVID-19 and two in-depth sessions on the clashing EU and Turkish foreign policy on the one end, and how the EU can help stabilize the Sahel in these very days where they are about to come up with a new regional strategy. Got a few interesting takeaways that is worth mentioning also today. The first is that the impact of COVID-19 pandemic is an interesting test case to note positive developments on the EU's role in conflict prevention, crisis response, and peace building. As noted yesterday by Hilde Hardeman, who's the Director and Head of Service for the policy instruments at the European Commission, the EU has sought opportunities to intervene between conflict parties to contribute to advance the conflict resolution agenda while providing relief to face the pandemic. One interesting mention was the case of the promotion of dialogue with the Taliban in Afghanistan for the access to medical facilities, which is a good example of the intersection of peace and security and the coronavirus response. Similarly, the protection of vulnerable population in countries that have large refugee groups played an important role to diffuse potential tensions. And we heard about the case of Lebanon and the Western Balkans, which we will discuss better today, looking at the Kosovo-Serbia dialogue. Second, the European Union has become more invested in developing forward-looking capacities and sensitive to early warning information. This is good news, and we hope they will continue investing down this path and maintain their efforts to develop a conflict prevention mindset in their operations, as well as their decision-making approach. While the EU external presence was reduced because of the pandemic, we learned from Stefano Tomat, Director for Integrated Approach for Security and Peace at the EAS, about the establishment of a 20-person pool of mediators and a more capable conflict prevention network where they seek to improve the skills of EU officials working in this very area. These are all helpful institutional improvements that can help them play a more effective role if they will be well synced with more investments in preventive efforts by the EU decision-making too. But we also looked at cases where the effectiveness of the EU approach is put into question because of the extent of the challenge faced by local populations, like in the Sahel, where the EU invested more than 8 billion over the past 7 years, and unfortunately, at the same time, the level of violence kept growing steadily. We hosted EU Special Representative Angelo Sada and the Deputy Special Representative of the UN Secretary General in Mali for MINUSMA, Ambassador Joanne Adamson, for a very interesting exchange with our colleagues, which you can find recorded on the same live streaming channel where we are in today. Furthermore, we looked at situations where the EU role is challenged by the growing assertiveness of other regional powers, and we zoomed in on Turkey for our first conversation. Together with Dr. Ilke Toygur and Dr. Ioannis Grigoriadis and our colleagues, we looked at the implications brought by colder relations, or rather very warming up tensions between Ankara, Brussels, and other European capitals, and the EU challenges in maintaining its incentives at the table while responding to the pressure on its own member states. Certainly also a most helpful conversation to remind ourselves of the importance of breaking some of the geographic silos in diplomacy when dealing with a regional power like Turkey that touches the EU and whose reach in conflict situations spans well beyond the EU neighborhood, for instance, through Central Asia, as we have seen with Turkey's, in the Caucasus, as we've seen with Turkey's involvement in Azerbaijan. So today will not be less. After the panel is about to start, we will have an excellent session to look at how the EU can increase the odds of a successful mediation between Kosovo and Serbia. And we will close the day looking at the economic fallout of COVID-19 in Latin America and what it means for peace and security in the continent. At the end of it, Lisa Jobson, our Director for Global Advocacy, will draw some conclusions. For these conversations, we will be joined by policy practitioners, regional experts, and diplomats working on peace and security from the European Union and its member states, as well as colleagues from civil society and international organizations. Let me remind that the meeting is on the record. We have about 150 registrations per each session, and a live streaming is ongoing via our YouTube channel, as I was mentioning, which yesterday's already gathered around 600 views combined, I think. And finally, let me stress that this event is part of an ongoing collaboration with the European Commission under the instrument contributing to stability and peace, and in partnership with the European External Action Service, who I thank very much on behalf of Crisis Group for the kind support, and most importantly, for the fruitful cooperation that we have. I really sincerely hope that the exchange between us will contribute to strengthen our reflections and improve the quality of their action in contexts where Crisis Group operates. Now, let me leave the floor for one of our key panels of this conference, which will look at how the EU can help get closer to an end of the Libyan conflict, hopefully, moderated by my colleague Joost Hilterman, our Program Director for Middle East and North Africa. Thank you all very much for your attention and your participation, and over to you, Joost.
Thank you very much, Giuseppe, and welcome everyone to the panel on Libya. My name is Joost Hilterman, and I am the Program Director for the Middle East and North Africa at the International Crisis Group. And the title of the panel, as Giuseppe said, is Can the EU do more to help end the Libyan conflict? We could have asked, can anyone do more to help end the Libyan conflict, or can the Libyan conflict be ended? But I hope to that our two panelists will be able to address all of these questions. And we have today with us, first of all, very happy to welcome here Ghassan Salamé, who is a former UN Special Representative of the Secretary General and former head of the UN support mission in Libya. He was there until not so long ago in that position, has now rejoined the Crisis Group board as co-chair, so we're very happy to see him. And with us also is Claudia Gazzini, who has been our senior analyst on Libya for the last 7 or 8 years, and who travels frequently to Libya and is totally immersed in this subject. So without further ado, we want to keep this conversational in the beginning, and I will ask some questions, and we'll do this for about half an hour. Then I will open the floor to questions, and opening the floor means basically that I will read any questions you may have written in the Q&A. So I would invite you, and you can start whenever you want, by putting questions in the Q&A. And as audience, you also have the opportunity to what they now call upvote any question that has already been posed in order to give it more prominence and more likelihood that I will in fact see it and pose it to the two panelists. So by all means, put questions in the Q&A from now on or whenever you want, and vote for them if you want to go that way, or don't, whatever you like, you can oppose them too. I wanted to start with the important matter that in the Libyan war, and we have seen many stages of it, most recently the assault by Field Marshal Khalifa Haftar's forces against Tripoli that started in April 2019, that we now have reached a ceasefire. And that is, of course, a source of hope. But also we've become very cautious in not being too optimistic. Ghassan, I wanted to ask you about the ceasefire, because it's been so difficult to accomplish. And I saw you right after the Haftar's offensive began, which basically put an end to all the good plans you had been preparing for a peace process in Libya, and you were distraught. How hopeful are you now that some progress can be reached now? And as you address that question, maybe it would be good to highlight both the local Libyan dimension, the regional one, and maybe the extra-regional one, where Russia, the United States, and the European countries also play a role, because each come at this conflict for different reasons, with different interests, and therefore have different reasons to either support or oppose a ceasefire and political talks.
Thank you, Joost. I don't rule out at all the possibility that the ceasefire reached will break down tomorrow and that it will be replaced by new confrontation. I don't rule out this possibility. I will never forget that Libya is a country full of more than 20 million pieces of weapons, that at least 9 countries are interfering in a way or the other in its own affairs, and that agreements are very often violated. I don't forget that. This is my preliminary statement, and it's very serious. However, I do believe that the conditions for an opportunity to get out of this cycle of violence that started in 2011 have never been as good as they are now. It doesn't mean the opportunity will be seized. It doesn't mean that all the conditions are there, but it means that we are in a much better configuration of situation than before. First, we have the Berlin Conference that produced 55 resolutions and produced the military talks between the two sides. And of the 3 major chapters, the military, the political, and the economic, the military is the one that has been working so far best. The first 2 meetings took place in Geneva. We came with a sort of plan for a ceasefire. Then came the fighting, then came COVID, then came a number of things. And when the 3rd meeting took place along there in Egypt, and more importantly, the 4th meeting of the so-called 5+5 military committee in Geneva, and then the 5th in Ghadames, less so the 6th in Sirte, which was less, I would say, promising than the meetings 4 and 5. You could see that there is some kind of an esprit de corps of which the two sides were to which they were sensitive. There was some will to go forward. There was a readiness that I haven't seen in January and February to meet together in the same room, then to meet alone without the UN, which is always a good sign, and finally to have a sort of to move all the negotiation, the military negotiation, into Libya, first to Ghadames and then to Sirte, where they built a sort of permanent place. So I am not saying this is great, it's the end of the war. No, I'm just saying that there are people in Libya who are taking the ceasefire seriously and they want to defend it. How did they reach there? The ceasefire was there. They declared it. The ceasefire was there because of a number of issues. One of them is that with Turkish help and Syrian mercenaries' help, the West has been able to kick out Haftar's troops from south and west of Tripoli. And it is true that there was a moment where there has been an attempt to cross the line and to go into the east. And I remember one big leader in Libya telling me on the phone, we will not stop before getting to Rajma. That's the headquarters of Haftar. But in fact, you could see that international diplomacy played a very important role. International diplomacy doesn't only mean UN diplomacy, or mainly at that point, UN diplomacy. In fact, for the first time, the Americans were engaged. They helped the Russians take to the east some of their material that was left in the West, and some of the Wagner Group people who were in the West. They helped them move to the east peacefully, and then slowly, gradually, without openly saying it, there has been some kind of an agreement, basically between the Americans, the Russians, and the Turks, that the Sirte-Jufra line is going to be the de facto, non-announced, non-formalized separation force line between the two until some kind of solution is found. What the military committee in the Berlin Conference, of which I'm very proud, I have to say, is trying to do is to break the possibility of transforming this line of being final and lead to the partition of the country by reopening the roads, in particular the coastal road, which is not done because there are people who are opposing it. So I'm very conscious of the problems, and also of trying to take the mercenaries out of the first line fight to the rear as a first step before sending them back home. So it is going in the right direction, thanks to international diplomacy, to American engagement, to the UN activity somehow, to the better or a higher level of seriousness in the military committee than in the political or in the economic one. But is this enough to say we have a ceasefire, a final ceasefire, and the war is over? Far from it, far from it. Everything remains vulnerable, but I would say there is here an opportunity, and there is an opportunity for Europe. I will go back to it because there is a role Europe can play very clearly in that, in consolidating the state of affairs that we should not miss.
Great, thanks, Ghassan. We'll come back to that shortly. Claudia, can you say a little bit about what was agreed in the Joint Military Commission? What has been implemented? What has not been implemented? And how could this be parlayed into a full-fledged political process? We've already seen an initial meeting in Tunis, but how do you see this going forward?
Thank you, Joost. So the ceasefire agreement that Ghassan referred to was signed in Geneva in October, and it established essentially four main points. The first one is that the two sides agreed to remove foreign mercenary forces aiding them from Libya. We know that the Tripoli-based forces are supported by Syrian pro-Ankara forces, and also have in their ranks Turkish military officers supporting them. On the other side, there are pro-Russia Syrian fighters, Chadian, Sudanese, you name it. On this point, so far we haven't seen any steps forward. We haven't seen a demobilization of these mercenary forces. It'll take time, but it is worrying that there has been little progress on this so far. The second point of the ceasefire is freezing foreign training of the military forces of the two sides. Turkey engages in ongoing training of forces allied to the Tripoli-based government. Egypt, Jordan, and a host of other countries support Haftar forces in training abroad. Again, we've seen backtracking on this issue of freezing foreign military training agreements. Turkey and the GNA have both boasted that this clause of the ceasefire agreement doesn't apply to them because their cooperation is fully legal and it's was ratified in MOUs in the past. So on the second point, little actual progress on the ground. The third point is the removal of the armed groups from the front lines. So the ceasefire establishes that in the central region, which Ghassan referred to earlier as, you know, the current sort of red line between the forces, that the two sides will send home their boys essentially to their military barracks. Again, we haven't seen an actual demobilization of forces in these areas. They're still there, and talks are ongoing on this point, and we hope there'll be a breakthrough, but again, zero actual progress on this point. Where there has been progress is on the less controversial issues, exchange of prisoners, reopening of flights, the roads, as we heard, haven't been reopened, although that was also part of the ceasefire deal. So really, I mean, there is this state of affairs where there is actual, no hostilities, there's no war going on, and there is a cessation of hostilities. But we are also, what we have in front of us is an agreement that so far is not really moving forward into the implementation phase. And this is worrying. And we're seeing also cargo flights, military cargo flights coming in regularly still to both sides, bringing in what exactly we don't know, but what we presume to be military equipment, landing both in eastern Libya supporting Haftar forces and in western Libya supporting Tripoli. So this adds to the state of fragility of the cessation of hostilities. And what worries me is that, I mean, we've always said that in Libya, the three points, the military track, the economic track, and the political track have to go hand in hand, or have to progress sort of simultaneously and in parallel. And not seeing actual implementation on the terms of the ceasefire is also causing a setback in the chances of political talks and an economic agreements moving forward.
Can you just say a few words about the political talk so far, Claudia?
Yeah, so the UN has reconvened Libyan representatives of the various factions. This was a track that Ghassan actually initiated before he left the mission. It envisaged bringing together representatives of the parliament, the HOR, representatives of the rival assembly based in Tripoli, called the State Council, and some independents that represented civil society, the tribes, the broader constituencies. Now they're 75. They convened in Tunis last week. The aim is to have this group of people agree on a unity government. So with the end of the conflict, there's the perfect opportunity to actually initiate talks and finally unify this country that has been divided since 2014 in rival governments and military coalitions. So the first objective of this talks is to come up with a new unity government, and the second one to establish a roadmap for elections. And you know, it was an uphill task from the outset to get these talks moving forward and making progress. There has been some progress, but it's only sort of limited to a broad agreement on the broad terms of, you know, what this new government should be doing, the division of competencies. There's been an agreement on a date for elections, but really we're still at that phase where we haven't seen a real breakthrough in terms of agreeing on the actual roadmap and agreeing to agree. We've agreed, there's sort of an agreement to the general terms, but I think it'll be very difficult to move forward in these peace talks and actually agree on a unity government. And let me say why. I mean, essentially, the problem I think Libya still faces and the Libyan constituency still faces is that they are divided between those who think that the path ahead requires reconciling with your former enemy and sharing, you know, holding hands and potentially sharing power. This means including in a new government, a new cabinet, representatives of the rival military factions. So representatives of the sort of pro-Haftar bloc, the pro-LNA bloc, and giving them sort of a seat in this new executive lineup, which also means the military, on the military side, considering that faction a counterpart, okay? And then there's another divide, the other group that actually doesn't see the path for peace and stability in Libya as possible by conceding to Haftar, by giving that faction through political talks, through diplomatic initiatives, a seat in power. And they actually insist that the only way to achieve peace and stability is to exclude that faction, to ensure that the LNA has no military standing in the future and no representative of that faction gains political power. So this is really the tension that is still undermining, I think, the political talks today.
Yeah, thanks very much. And we see it in so many conflicts, this choice between reintegrating somehow and reunifying factions that have been fighting each other, or deciding not to, which could either lead to further warfare, further military actions, and sort of down the road to some very bad situations, or physical separation between, in this case, between Cyrenaica and Tripolitani. So these possibilities are still there, and it's a very difficult predicament. The other one, Ghassan, is in process, and I think you at the UN have faced this when you were in charge, between choosing to go for new elections or some other kind of great conference that is very inclusive in order to restore the legitimacy of the institutions that have been established and to establish maybe some new ones, and keeping the current institutions, trying to bring them back together and to fix them. And that's you know, it's either way, it's a difficult way to go. And I don't know where you stand now on what would be the best way forward. Should there be elections soon? Should there be elections not soon? Should there be an attempt to fix Schedat and the councils and institutions that were established there? What do you think?
Look, my friend, when I was in Iraq, I was opposed to elections. Elections should take place when things are quiet, when people can apply to a job without getting killed, where there is no so many weapons in the hands of the population. So I'm not obsessed with elections. I'm certainly less enthusiastic for election than the average in Brussels, among Brussels bureaucrats. However, you have a very specific problem in Libya. And the problem is the following. I can summarize it in one anecdote. Once I went to see the Supreme Judicial Council in the country that has a constitutional chamber in principle. And I asked them, why did you close down the constitutional chamber? Because if you have a constitutional chamber, it will make our life much easier to say who's legitimate, who's not legitimate, whose time has passed, whose time has not passed, who is properly. And I remember them giving me two answers. One, if we get into this kind of issues, and we have 55 cases, constitutional cases, pending before that chamber, 55 cases. If we start judging these cases, the chance for us to go into paradise much earlier than we wanted to go is very high. But the other one was no less interesting answer. If we decide what institution in the country, including the central bank, the LNA, the GNA, the HOR, the HCS, etc., is legitimate, all the answers are going to be no. There is no legitimate institution in the country. So therefore, you are faced with this situation. There is no legitimate institution in the country, and there is no international entity to say it, because they have decided not to say it. So what do you do as a UN guy? You try to bring together the substitute for an election that is difficult to organize in these circumstances because of many issues, because there is no electoral law, because the HOR and the HAS members do not want elections because it means their end, because Mr. Sarraj doesn't want election, because nobody wants election. The whole political class is so corrupt and so attached to its positions that they don't want election. You try to substitute that with a representative group of the whole society that makes an arrangement that is acceptable to all the segments of the population or to a large segment of the population until the time when you can have elections. So what is happening now is something of that. They have fixed the election on the National Day of next year for the 70th anniversary of the creation of modern Libya on the 24th of December of 2021. In the meanwhile, there is this idea that you need a united government because you have at least two, one in Benghazi and the other one in Tripoli, one recognized by the UN and one is not. A united government in order to organize these elections and to handle the country for the year separating us from this election. That's where there is a problem. And the problem is the following, it's very clear in my view. It is that most of the Libyans would like to see other people handle that period. And those who are in place will do their utmost to impede the possibility of them being kicked out of their positions. Because the real problem, and Madame Ghazini knows exactly my view of that, the real problem in Libya is that the fact that the relationship between being in one political position and making a lot of money is very intimate. In fact, I would say that many politicians are in politics mainly to make money, not even to have prestige or to have power or to have whatever Max Weber has told us people go into politics for. They are there to make money. So basically, you are telling them you are not going to make money. That's why they will fight back. And what we have been seeing in the past few years, that whenever we start talking, everybody says, I'm for election, I'm for election. Okay, let's organize the period between now and the election. No, this is unacceptable. We need a system to agree upon, etc. Well, there is an attempt taking place now, led by Stephanie Williams and the mission, in order to produce one of the many modalities we have put in place in order to select a provisional government, but united for the whole country between now and December 2021, when elections can take place. And because elections can take place logistically, the HNEC, the High National Electoral Committee, was attacked by Daesh 2 years ago, and the UN gathered $9 million in order to rebuild it from scratch. So it is there, and it can handle the elections logistically. What you need is a climate of security, is a law that is produced, is money given by the GNA for the guys who work at the HNEC because everybody is for election, but nobody does his duty in order to organize this election, which means that they don't want election in practical terms. Therefore, the tension is there. Elections have been fixed. How do we organize a united government between now and the next election? I don't think having two governments would help. It's better to have a united government. It's better to have a government made of technocrats. It is better to have a government made of people who commit not to run in the next election so they have some credibility. It is better to have some kind of support, and that's where Europe can help a lot, for the HNEC and for this government to organize these elections. So it is better to do that. So I hope that between now and 2-3 weeks from now, they finally agree to choose a modality. I think they are now voting digitally, the 75 of them, in order to produce something in the next 3-4 days. So we know what kind of modality they would accept to select this government. It's not a democratic government. It's an arrangement government that will have to prepare for democratic election sometime in the future. One thing that is important is the relationship Madame Ghazini has mentioned between the political, the military, and the economic tracks. It's very, very crucial. It is, in my view, a big mistake to say this is the same thing, they should operate together. No, sometimes one of them can go further than the other for some reason or the other. First, because the military are more disciplined, or because economic issues are less sensitive, say, than electoral issues. But there is also a connection you cannot ignore. And if one of the three tracks advances alone, it will be very vulnerable if the political and the economic tracks do not go with it. That is why the progress made in the military, despite the limitations mentioned by my friend, is still something that that needs to be reinforced by a similar progress in the political and in the economic tracks. Otherwise, it will remain extremely vulnerable. So no confusion of the tracks, but no entire independence of them. There is a subtle connection between the three tracks that needs to be found here.
Thanks, Ghassan. I remind everyone that the floor is open for questions, so I haven't seen any yet, but I will continue to put some questions of my own. But please, if you have questions that you have for Ghassan or for Madame Gazzini, please put them now in the Q&A. Ghassan, you already referred to what Europe should be doing. Of course, we have Irini, and maybe you have a view on how that is working out. And then you mentioned support for the electoral process. What else do you think the UN should be doing better, or maybe should be doing less of?
Look, one can be easily passionate about the European role in Libya by becoming very negative or very positive. I am neither positive nor negative. I'm very realistic. I think Europe is doing, the EU is doing a number of excellent things in Libya. First, it has been supporting the UN mission financially, without which the UN should not have been able to think of the political track, for example. So it is supporting this. Second, it is exchanging information when necessary. Three, it is also helping in bringing together the Europeans to a common stand in the Security Council. And this Europe is doing and doing very well. And it is not an accident that when I was given the choice to find a place in order to bring together all the relevant countries interested in Libya for a summit meeting, I have selected a European country. A European country that had two qualities, an influential one without being directly involved one. That was why we went to Berlin for that conference. And I should say that Mrs. Merkel has played a very crucial role in the convening and in the success of that meeting. So there are things Europe or some Europeans are doing that are very good. But there are things that Europe should not do. I kept saying in my life, the worst thing for Europe is to become the banker of a peace process that is engineered by others. And that's exactly what Europe has been doing in the Arab-Israeli conflict. That has been paying 1 time, 2 times, 3 times for Gaza to have an airport. But Europe was never the engineer of any agreement between the Israelis and the Palestinians. I think in Libya, there is a possibility for the Europeans to play a role. They need to be united, and they need to ask themselves a very central question. Do they want a Libyan state or not? Are they happy with Libya when they can interfere or not interfere or not? I think they should have learned in the past year that the French-Italian rivalry has led, in fact, to their exclusion, both of them, to the advantage of non-EU countries, who are playing now a much larger role in daily life. The Russians, the Turks, the Egyptians, you name it, the Americans. So they need to be united, and they need to have an idea of what they want to do, besides supporting the UN. And I think they can do a lot in terms of institution building for 2 reasons. The first reason is that I know enough the UN to say that the UN is unable to do institution building. The UN is dysfunctional and is unable to go into institution building. The EU can. Second, it can, by so doing, reinforce the 3 tracks. Because in the 3 tracks, you need institution building. You need to reunify and train, which is very central, very crucial, the guardians of the oil fields, which is a troop that is entirely chaotic. You need, in the military sector, to train monitors, to train people into demining, to train people to help sending back the mercenaries, etc., etc., etc. In the political track, you need people to help in organizing the elections and bringing the Libyans together. So if there is a central decision to which the Europeans have answered clearly, in my view, they haven't so far, to be very honest. If they say, yes, we want a state, only a strong state in Libya, unified state, legitimate state, can stop migration, can fight COVID, can fight terrorism. Only that. It is not a weak state that allows for everybody and his cousin to interfere. This is short-term solution. The real solution is a strong, legitimate, united government in Libya. If this is clear in their mind, there is a huge work to be done by the EU. And they could have a special office or a special representative doing exactly that, because it's a many-year project, but it needs first to answer the question I asked. Have they resigned themselves to Libya as a space where they try to limit the damage, to contain the risk, or they have decided that their long-term interest is in the re-emergence of a legitimate, central, unified government in the country? And if the answer is yes to that question, it cannot be done without the European Union. It needs to be done with the help of the European Union.
Thanks, Ghassan. I think we're going to have to wait a little bit for a European answer to that fundamental question. So in the meantime, I'm going to look at the Q&A, the questions submitted so far. And first one, Claudia, is for you. How do you see the role of Russia and Turkey in the implementation of the ceasefire? How can they be brought to support it constructively? And not, of course, only Russia and Turkey. There is also, these are parties on the opposite side. There is also the United Arab Emirates, that is also on Haftar's side, along with
Frozen.
I think is the role of these actors in contributing to a ceasefire, and will they actually support a ceasefire, and why have they done it so far?
Thank you. Great question. You know, unfortunately, what we saw after the pronouncement of the ceasefire and the publication of the text, what we saw was that the internationals, the foreign capitals that are supporting Libyan factions, are paying lip service and say that they support the ceasefire, but behind that there still is a very self-serving interest to promote a ceasefire and ensure that it lasts, but on each country's own terms and on the basis of each country's strategic interest. So what we're seeing is that, you know, Turkey is supporting the cessation of hostility, but the long-term interest there is to continue to consolidate the authority and the power of the security forces allied with the Tripoli government, because there's a strategic long-term interest there that is ensuring Turkey's economic and security prerogatives. And that means pushing away or debilitating or weakening military rivals that are allied with Turkey's foes, the Emirates, Cairo, and Russia. And on the other side, we're seeing similar dynamics. Cairo and Abu Dhabi see as their prerogative to see Turkey out of Libya, because they view this as a threat not only for Libya. It's not the issue there is not Libya, but for the Gulf capitals themselves. They see this, militarized country seeking to project power in the region as an existential threat to them. So they're supportive of a ceasefire, but they seem to be saying, well, we want to see the Turks out first. Russia is a different case, because Russia is supporting Haftar forces as well, and I think it's no secret that there is a certain degree of coordination with Cairo and Abu Dhabi as well in their support, because these are Russian military private contractors that are on the ground and essentially are helping Haftar forces maintain terrain. So what is needed is, in order for these countries to actively support a ceasefire and a de-escalation, is also increased dialogue, I think, with these important regional foes. Dialogue between Cairo and Ankara hasn't really taken place. It's a very contentious issue. They are regional foes, but if we want to see each side supporting their local allies in moving forward towards really a peace process, it'll be necessary to open channels of communications and have reassurances that each side's strategic interests will not be infringed. Is this are the two sides' long-term strategic interests compatible? Difficult to say yes at that as things stand, but certainly a less hostile regional environment and international environment will also help. The issue of Russia is key here, even in relation to the EU, because some EU countries, you could rightly say that it's NATO's strategic interest to get Russia out of Libya, and therefore, by extension, this means supporting a future Libyan government that is more allied with Ankara, if you want, or is firmly rejecting the presence of Russian military forces on the ground. So if you think, if you're looking at Libya with this very anti-Russian sort of NATO prerogative, then you can see where you stand in terms of what is that strong central government that Ghassan was referring to before would look like. But if Russia is not your main foe, international foe in Libya, and Turkey is, then you would see that your personal inclination or a capital's inclination would be to see a strong government that actually sees that country as the hindering progress. So it's very hard to see a point of contact, but I think the way forward to have outside support for a ceasefire and cessation of hostilities is certainly by increasing dialogue and channels of communication between these regional actors, and stopping, I must add, their approach to Libya as a sort of military adventure where you can just throw in weapons and let Libyan factions fight it out. This also helps. It would help to stop the flow of weapons, and I think the US has a role there in also limiting the sales of weapons to allied countries, well knowing that this would reach Libya.
Ghassan, I'll come back to you shortly to ask you about the Biden administration. But Claudia, we've seen the Berlin process that was quite inclusive. We've also seen a Russian-Turkish track. You're talking about the necessity of opening channels of communication and bringing the regional powers or the outside actors together. We've talked about the political process in Libya, but what is the process outside Libya in order to ensure that the Libyan actors will actually sit together and move forward rather than continue to fight what is essentially a proxy war?
Yeah, I mean, you're right. The Berlin track, the Berlin process, which Ghassan initiated, envisages follow-up committees. And who's part of these follow-up committees? The countries that are part of the Berlin process. These are a dozen or so countries and institutions that have a direct or indirect stake in the Libyan conflict. Okay, so you have these follow-up committees. One is military, one is economic, and one is political, where you do have these regional foes sitting around the table. This means, in some cases, Turkey and Cairo and so on are being part of these follow-up committees.
The connection is poor.
Is it my connection that is? Can you hear me? Hello?
Yes, Claudia, we can hear you well.
Okay. So the problem is, in the COVID era, these follow-up committee meetings happen like this one that we're having today. It is essentially an online conversation. And as you know, in diplomacy, there's only a limit to how much you can talk, agree on through Zoom or Google chat conversations. That behind the scenes in the hotel lobby or corridors conversation is very important to actually move a process forward. And I think, unfortunately, because of the reality we're in, that dimension and that more informal setting for talks is missing. So there's only a limit to how much you can really understand your international interlocutors, your Russian diplomat or your Egyptian diplomat and so on, through a Zoom meeting. And what we're missing is a more sort of behind the scenes private forum where that dialogue can really come about.
Yeah, there's another question from the audience, but before I come to that, I wanted to ask Ghassan about the elections in the United States. We now have a clear outcome. President-elect Biden has started to appoint some of his key officials. What do you think this means for the conflict in Libya? Is there an opportunity that the United States will use its diplomatic muscle to weigh in a positive way?
Look, let me say that in the past year or so, I have seen something interesting. The lack of interest of Mr. Trump for Libya allowed lower level in the administration to play a very active role almost freely. And I was happy with that. And they were supportive. They were supportive in bringing back the oil flow. They were supporting in fighting against terrorists. And to my surprise, they were also supportive in drawing the de facto red line and in helping organize more or less the three tracks. So I am less critical than I have been like 1 year ago. Not so much because all of a sudden Mr. Trump got some interest and gave instructions, but I think because he was busy doing something else, and it allowed reasonable people in the administration to operate a bit more freely. Now with the new administration, I'm half-half. On the one hand, I'm happy because I see people I have been working with in the past 30 years of my life, in the Clinton administration, but also in the Obama administration, getting back to where they were and more often to a higher position, which means that with age, seniority gives you some possibilities, which is great. As a senior man, I recognize that. However, I have to be very honest. I'm also worried. I'm very worried. Because I keep asking myself, is it chapter 3 of the Democrat book since the end of the Cold War? Chapter 1 was Clinton, chapter 2 was Obama, and chapter 3 is going to be Biden. When I see the same people coming back, I ask myself, did these guys recognize that they also made mistakes? That they treated Russia in the aftermath of the end of the Cold War with a lot of despise and a lot of paternalism. And this has created a very deep animosity among the Russians that we are paying for until now. Do they recognize that? Do they recognize they treated China as a factory or as a market and never ask themselves if this going or not going to allow China to become a geopolitical power? And it became a geopolitical power while they were asleep. Do they ask themselves these questions? Do they ask themselves if attacking Iraq in 2003, and you know, Yost, that I was opposed to that, or attacking Libya in 2011, and I was also opposed to that, were two errors, in my view. And Obama says it was a mistake now. And Biden says that he regrets that he supported the war. But do they have a new idea of intervention? Did they develop some kind of a new doctrine, some kind of revisiting some of the mistakes they did? And are they going to remain silent on Yemen? Are they going to remain silent? What are they going to do with Iran? With Iran, of course, Trump didn't want the ceasefire. Okay, this is clear. He went out, but the Iranians also, on the other hand, they went way beyond the level of uranium, enriched uranium, the agreement has stated for them. The whole agreement was done without even asking their view for Iran's neighbors. Is this going to continue? And to a large extent, the question of the missiles was not asked during all this. Is this going to continue? Are we going to go into a new agreement? What kind of agreement? When? With the participation of whom? So yes, I welcome the arrival of people who are reasonable and well-informed and experienced under Obama and under Clinton. But I keep asking myself, did they revisit some of their worst decisions when they were in power or not? Or are we going to have just the chapter 3 of a book we have already read, chapter 1 and chapter 2?
Well, it's an excellent question. And of course, this is on a whole range of issues, as you already indicated, not just Iran, of course, and Libya, but many others. And maybe there will be some kind of Biden doctrine. And I hope that with your seniority and experience, Ghassan, you will inform that, and it will become known also as the Ghassan Salamé doctrine. So,
no way.
But let me go back to there's a question about the lack of progress on the economic track, which of course has to do with the oil production and export, and that in itself has to do with the unification or reunification of the national oil company and of the central bank. Claudia, can I ask you about why there has been some progress, because now since September we see that there's an agreement on restarting the oil production. And so right now, oil is being pumped back at high levels, but the situation remains fragile, as we have now heard. How do you see that? How do you explain the lack of real progress on this issue? And quite separate from that, but linked to it, is can you say something about the current humanitarian situation in Libya and what we should be looking out for?
Yes. Well, first of all, let me clarify that when we talk about the resumption of oil production in Libya, what we mean is that there was essentially a deal between some representatives in Tripoli, of the Tripoli government, and the coalition of Haftar that allowed Haftar to reopen the deal, reopen the oil ports, and this sort of led to the production increase again. There was American pressure as well, international pressure to get oil production going. This is not the economic track. When we talk about the economic track negotiations, we mean something slightly different. We mean a process that is supported by the UN and the Americans especially, to get a consensus on essentially how to unify economic and financial institutions, mainly the central bank. So it's a debate about the central bank. In Libya, you have polarized views over the central bank. Haftar faction.
In Lebanon too. In Lebanon too.
And you share a surname, a very important surname with the governor.
The central bank in Lebanon, yes.
No relation. No relation.
Of course
Are
not.
you? for you. But in Libya, the country is divided between essentially those who say that the central bank needs to be reformed. In particular, a board needs to be reconstituted because the central bank is operating without a board. And this faction is the Haftar faction and his allies, who see the central bank as a pawn in the hands of the Islamists and argue that their control over the central bank has allowed Libyan state funds to be funneled towards armed groups of that faction and possibly also foreign countries allied to that faction. So they are insisting on moving forward with the reform of the central bank and changing the central bank governor. So the UN-led negotiations or dialogue, because it's not really a negotiation, was aimed at pursuing this channel of dialogue and coming up with an agreement on how this central bank institution could be reformed, how a new leadership could be appointed. Unfortunately, that effectively hasn't progressed because we've reached a point where this committee, this dialogue committee, has made recommendations, but then again, moving from the phase of recommendations to the implementation of the recommendations has not been possible because of the power sort of struggles that are happening on the ground. And we're seeing this tension reemerge more forcefully these days because the deal to reopen the oil production was never made official. We don't know actually we know what the deal was, but we don't know what the operating framework for the NOC is now. There's a sort of an agreement that oil revenues will not go to the central bank, but will be stopped at a transit bank called the Libyan Foreign Bank that receives foreign payments. This, again, was never written. We don't have a presidential decree. We haven't seen Siraj made this official, but there's sort of an understanding that that is how things will go. And this has sort of caused an eruption of new tensions between these rival institutions, the Presidency Council in Tripoli on one side, the NOC that manages oil in Libya, and the central bank. So to go back to the main point of how the economy and economic agreement can support the political and the military, we're again seeing this sort of hiccup progress. You've got oil, but you don't have the agreement on the financial institutions. We'll see what happens.
And on the humanitarian, can you say something about
yes,
that? Because
sorry,
I think it's important to know. And then just in 1 minute, because we have only 3 minutes left, and I want to give Ghassan a chance to.
Yes. Unfortunately for Libya, for Libyans, the end of the Tripoli war certainly has not meant an improved sort of humanitarian or improved living standards in the country. Yes, of course, residential neighborhoods in Tripoli that were before being besieged are now, easily accessed, but we have landmines there, IEDs, but overall, throughout the country, we're seeing a steady deterioration of living standards, rising living costs. Officially, they rate inflation at 1%. World Bank estimates around 20. Somebody was saying 60% the other day. So living costs are high. There's a banking crisis. There's no cash availability, and there are hundreds of thousands of IDPs across the country. So there's increased risk of the need for humanitarian aid to an increasing number of families throughout the country, and complete lack of basic services. So it is a crisis of governance, really, that impacts the way Libyans live today.
So thanks, Claudia. And Ghassan, maybe to sum up, are we witnessing today the slow total collapse of Libya or the slow recovery of Libya? Where do you think things are going? You were cautiously hopeful, I think, when I heard you speak, while giving a devastating analysis.
Look, to add to what Claudia said, to put it in a nutshell, 2 years ago, 1 out of 6 million Libyans needed help. Today it's 2 million need, which means that the number has doubled, and you have now basically 1/3 of the population that needs extra help. That tells you something about the lack of services and the lack of help in a country that should be living like Kuwait. In fact, if you need to define Libya, you would say it's Kuwait in oil revenues and Somalia in way of life. That's Libya. And it's more than ever like this. I would say that the situation today includes a real opportunity to get out of the cycle of violence, a real opportunity. But what I see is that there is more reluctance on the part of intervening countries to intervene. Although, as Claudia said, there is still weapons coming and mercenaries coming and things. I agree, but less so in value and in numbers. So there is an opportunity, but the countries who have been intervening are intervening much less, but the country who should support are supporting very little. So therefore you are in a sort of situation, a very vague situation, where an opportunity is there, mainly Libyan-led, with some revival of Libyan patriotism, not big, but some revival of Libyan patriotism that needed more support from outside. What we are seeing is less intervention, but not more support.
We're going to have to leave it at that, but thanks so much, Ghassan, Salamé. Thank you, Claudia Gazzini, and I'm sure we'll have to continue this conversation for months, maybe years to come. Thank you, and have a good day.
Thank you. Bye.